For so long, my parents told everyone I was the responsible one, the one who would always do the right thing. So when they showed up 3 days after my wedding with a legal contract and told me to sign my house over to my younger brother, they expected the same thing they'd gotten for 38 years, obedience. What they didn't realize was that the moment I picked up that pen, I had already set something in motion they would never see coming. And by the time they came to claim the house, everything was already gone. The morning my parents came to claim my house, they stood on my front porch smiling like they had just won something at auction. My father had a brown folder tucked under his arm, the kind with stiff metal prongs inside, and my mother carried a tray of store-bought blueberry muffins as if this were some warm little family visit instead of a property ambush. My younger brother Jason leaned against his truck in the driveway with that smug, loose-jawed grin he used to wear as a kid whenever he knew he'd broken something and was about to get away with it. But that smile lasted maybe 10 minutes, because by the time they opened the front door, the place was empty. No couch, no dishes, no framed photos, no bedroom set, no curtains, just bare floors, blank walls, and the cold echo of their own footsteps bouncing back at them. That was the moment the performance ended. That was the moment my parents realized I had not done what they thought I'd done. But to understand why that house was empty, you have to go back 3 days earlier, to my wedding, because that was the day something inside me finally stopped negotiating with them. I got married on a warm Saturday afternoon in late May. One of those Ohio spring days that feels almost suspiciously pretty, as if the sky has been paid extra to behave. Blue overhead, light breeze, fresh-cut grass in the air, and all the windows of the little brick church on Maple Street thrown open, so the breeze could carry the music out into the parking lot. I was 38 years old, and I remember thinking while standing in the church basement with Rachel pinning the last section of my veil into place, that for the first time in my life, I was stepping into something no one had handed me, manipulated me into, or guilt me through. My husband Daniel was waiting at the front of the church in a dark suit that fit well enough to pass, though if you looked closely you could still see the faint half-moons of old grease around his cuticles. He had scrubbed his hands twice that morning. I knew because I watched him do it in our kitchen while pretending not to be emotional about the day. Daniel owns a small repair shop on the west side of Columbus. 3 bays, 1 ancient coffee machine, and a customer base loyal enough to keep him busy because trust is harder to find than cheap labor. I'm a nurse at Riverside Methodist. 15 years in, long shifts, bad coffee, aching feet, and just enough humanity left in me to still believe people can be decent if they try. That was one of the things Daniel and I had in common. We were not glamorous people. We were useful people, tired people, honest people, which in my family ranked somewhere below temporarily impressive. My parents never said Daniel wasn't good enough in so many words, because people like my parents prefer to season their contempt and serve it as concern. My mother would ask things like, "So do mechanics get health insurance through their own shops?" In that soft tone women use when they want to sound curious while checking whether you've made an embarrassing choice. My father once asked Daniel over pot roast, "Do you think wrenching on transmissions is something you'll still want to be doing at 50? As if Daniel were a confused teenager and not a grown man who had built a stable business with his own hands. Still, they came to the wedding. They sat in the second row, stiff and quiet. My mother wore a pale blue dress that looked less like celebration and more like she was attending a luncheon for controlled disappointment. My father checked his watch twice during the ceremony, which takes a special kind of talent if your daughter is walking down the aisle and you still somehow behave like the event is running over schedule. Jason arrived late, of course. Jason was 3 years younger than me, but my parents treated him like the world had been especially harsh to him for the crime of existing without discipline. When he wrecked his first car at 19, they bought him another one. When he dropped out of community college, they said traditional education simply didn't reflect his gifts. when his landscaping business folded after 2 summers because apparently cash flow is not a mystical concept and clients do like their jobs finished. My mother blamed the economy and my father blamed bad timing. Meanwhile, I worked doubles to pay my way through nursing school and bought my first used Honda with money I saved by eating cafeteria soup and pretending exhaustion was a hobby. That was the family arrangement. Jason needed support. I needed character. He got rescue. I got speeches about resilience. Some of you already know that family math. If you do, tell me where you're watching from, because I know this kind of story lands hard in certain houses. Drop your city and state in the comments if this kind of favoritism feels familiar. The wedding itself was small. Church ceremony, then dinner downtown at a family-owned restaurant with white tablecloths trying their best, and a piano player who kept drifting into songs nobody requested, but everybody forgave because the cannoli were good. Nothing flashy. No crystal chandeliers. No 12-piece band. Just friends, co-workers, Daniel's family, and a handful of relatives. Daniel's mother cried through the vows. His sister laughed too loud at the toast. One of his cousins knocked over a wine glass and apologized like he'd sunk a ship. It felt human. It felt alive. It felt like what I had wanted all along. And underneath it all sat the thing that mattered most to me. More than the dress, more than the flowers, more than the ceremony itself. The house. That little white-sided 2-bedroom house on Oak Ridge Lane meant more to me than anyone in my family ever understood. Maybe because I never let them see what it cost. 10 years of overtime shifts. 10 years of saying no to beach trips. No to new furniture. No to the kind of spending that makes life feel lighter in the short term and heavier in the long term. I bought that house by myself. Signed the papers alone. Sat in my car after closing with both hands on the steering wheel and cried so hard I had to wait 20 minutes before driving home. Not because the house was grand. It wasn't. It had a small porch. White siding that needed repainting every few years, one bathroom with tile old enough to remember 2 wars, and a kitchen so narrow 2 people couldn't pass each other without negotiating. But it was mine. Mine in a way nothing had ever been mine growing up in that family. No sibling negotiation. No emotional invoice attached. No you owe us. Just a mortgage, a mailbox, and proof that I could build a life without waiting for anyone to approve of it. 3 days after the wedding, Daniel and I were still unpacking gifts when the doorbell rang. I remember exactly what I was doing. Standing at the counter, peeling tape off a box of dish towels from Daniel's aunt, the late afternoon sun slanting across the kitchen floor, his wedding ring catching light as he wrestled with a blender box in the living room. The doorbell rang once, then again, sharper the second time, the way family does when they already assume the door belongs to them. I opened it and there they were. My parents on the porch, Jason behind them, my father with that folder under his arm, my mother with the muffins, smiling, too much smiling, the kind of smiling people do when they want the scene to feel normal before they drag something ugly into it. Emily, my mother said in that falsely bright voice that always meant danger in a cardigan. We need to talk. Daniel came into the hallway behind me, drying his hands on a dish towel. My father walked past me into the living room before I had invited anyone in, which told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. Jason followed, glancing around the house with a look I didn't understand then, but would understand all too well 10 minutes later. My mother set the muffins on the kitchen table, like this was Sunday after church. Then my father opened the folder and slid a document toward me. Sign this, he said. No easing in. No fake preamble. Just command. I looked down. Property transfer agreement. My house. Jason's name. My eyes moved across the lines, once, then again, because sometimes reality arrives looking so stupid you think your brain must be misreading it on principle. I don't understand, I said. Jason cleared his throat and leaned back in the chair like a man arriving for a benefit in his honor. "I'm starting a new business," he said. My mother nodded fast. "And your brother needs a place to live while he gets it going." My father folded his arms. "You owe this family, Emily." And there it was, the line beneath all the other lines. Not congratulations on your marriage. Not we're proud of what you built. Not your home looks lovely. Just the old family debt, dragged onto my kitchen table in legal print. I looked at Daniel. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He just watched, calm and quiet, which was its own kind of support because Daniel knew something my parents didn't. He knew I was done being the strong one in the way they meant it. I looked back at the contract, then at my father, then at Jason sitting in my dining chair like he was already measuring for curtains. "If I sign this," I asked, and my voice was steadier than I felt, "will it finally be enough?" My father answered without hesitation. Yes, that one word told me more truth than 38 years of family behavior had managed to say out loud. And that was the exact moment I picked up the pen. The pen felt cheap. That's what I remember first. Not heavy, not cinematic, not trembling in my hand like people describe in stories when they want the moment to sound noble. It was just one of those plastic blue pens my mother kept in her purse for crossword puzzles and church bulletins, and somehow that made it worse. Because there I was, 38 years old, standing in the kitchen of the first home I had ever owned, about to sign away 10 years of overtime shifts and swollen feet and nights where I fell asleep in scrubs still smelling like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, and the instrument of my emotional execution looked like it had been borrowed from a bank counter. My father stood with both arms folded, watching me with that expression he always wore when he thought he was being practical and magnanimous at the same time. My mother was smiling too softly, the way women do when they want to pass off coercion as family love. Jason sat back in one of my dining chairs, legs spread, fingers drumming on the table, already behaving like a man trying to decide whether he'd knock down a wall or just repaint the place some hideous masculine gray. Daniel stayed where he was by the counter, quiet, steady, not absent. There's a difference. People who don't understand real loyalty think love always enters a room making speeches. Sometimes the strongest support in the room is the person who trusts you enough to let you play the hand you've already decided on. "Well," my father said, because patience had never been his strongest Christian virtue. I lowered the pen and signed. My full name, clean and legible, exactly the way I had signed every important document of my adult life. Nursing forms, mortgage documents, tax records, hospital renewals. The same handwriting I used to build things was now being used, at least from their point of view, to surrender one. My father leaned forward before the ink was even dry and slid the pages toward himself. Jason let out a low little whistle. "Wow," he said, with the kind of awesome men reserve for seeing a fish jump or a woman back down. That was easier than I thought. Easier than I thought. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and what hit me wasn't anger at first. It was embarrassment. Not mine. His. Because he actually thought this was a win. He thought he just watched his sister fold. My mother patted the back of my hand. "You won't regret this," she said gently. And if there were an Olympic event for mothers saying catastrophic things in soothing tones, she'd have taken gold and then complained the metal wasn't polished enough. Daniel walked over, took the contract from my father's hands with one calm motion, and glanced over the pages. He nodded once, as if confirming a detail on an oil change receipt, and handed it back. "Looks official," he said. My father tucked the folder under his arm again, satisfied now that legality had been stapled to his entitlement. "We'll come by tomorrow morning," he said. "Jason will need the keys." Jason stood and looked around the house again, and the way his eyes moved made my skin crawl. Not because he loved the place, Because he was calculating possession. Yeah, he said. I'll probably repaint the living room first. And the kitchen cabinets could go. Too much Old Lady White in here. Old Lady White. I had painted those cabinets myself over 2 weekends with a fan in the window and a podcast playing through one dying earbud because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. And here he was, insulting them before the transfer had even legally cleared. My mother paused at the door and gave me that tragic soft look she used when she wanted to believe her own lies. You did the right thing, she said. Then they were gone. The whole house exhaled after the front door shut. Silence settled in around the muffin tray and the unsigned thank you cards on the counter and the crooked stack of wedding gifts still waiting to be opened. For a full 5 seconds, Daniel and I didn't move. Then he tilted his head toward the door and said, "Well, that was some high-level nonsense." I laughed, and it came out sharper than I meant it to, almost like a crack in glass. "You're not even going to ask why I signed it," I said. Daniel walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, took a sip, and looked at me over the rim. "Nope, nope, nope," he repeated. "Because you didn't just give away your house." That was the moment my shoulders finally dropped. Not because I needed permission, because being understood at the right speed is one of the most intimate things in the world. "You noticed," I said. "Emily," he said, setting the glass down. "I watched you refinance that place last year. I was sitting at this exact table when you came home from the lawyer's office waving papers around, like you'd just gotten citizenship in a better country. I know whose name is on what." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "You ready?" "For what?" "For the part where we disappear." The truth is, this hadn't been fully improvised. Not emotionally, maybe, but structurally, Daniel and I had talked in loose circles around something like this for months. Not this exact stunt, because even my family's talent for selfishness occasionally managed to exceed the imagination. But the pattern, yes. The expectation that I would always be the one to bend, because I was the strong one. The way every holiday seemed to end with Jason needing something and my parents staring at me like I was a backup generator with feelings. Daniel had asked me once, months earlier, while we were scraping wallpaper in the guest room, "What do you think happens if you ever just stop cooperating?" At the time I shrugged and said something brave and fake, like they'd get over it. He looked at me and said no. They'd panic, because your role is what keeps their version of the family working. I didn't understand how right he was until that afternoon. "We should move now," I said. Daniel nodded immediately. No dramatic pause. "No, are you sure?" He trusted my timing. "I'll back the truck in." And that was that. No screaming breakdown. No revenge montage with dangerous music. Just deliberate movement. The most powerful moments in life often look boring to strangers. Daniel backed the pickup into the driveway at 6:15. I started in the bedroom. Suitcases first, then clothes, then the cedar box for my grandmother, then the small frame photograph of me on closing day standing in front of the house with a ridiculous smile and a paper sign from the realtor. In the bathroom, I packed towels, medication, hairbrush, the little ceramic tray from Rachel, the cheap shower caddy that had somehow survived 3 apartments and 1 emotionally dishonest engagement before Daniel. In the kitchen, I wrapped dishes in newspaper, emptied drawers, packed spices, labeled boxes. The fridge was half full from wedding leftovers and practical adulthood: eggs, yogurt, cut fruit, 3 bottles of dressing, and 1 lonely champagne split from our reception. Daniel unplugged the refrigerator and Dolly walked it out the front door like this was just another Tuesday. That man can remove an appliance with less emotional disruption than my family can choose a brunch spot. Piece by piece, the house changed. Couch gone. Dining table gone. Bed, dresser, lamps, wedding gifts, artwork, cookware, blankets. The rooms began to echo by 8:30. Every object removed left behind a pale square on the wall, or a cleaner patch of wood on the floor, like proof of a life lifting itself and refusing to leave fingerprints for looters. At one point, I stood in the empty living room holding the framed photo from my nursing school graduation and just looked around. 10 years. 10 years of mortgage payments. 10 years of replacing things one at a time as I could afford them. 10 years of proving to myself, quietly, that I could build a stable life without anyone's rescue. And now here I was undoing the visible version of that life in under 4 hours. You'd think I would have cried harder. I didn't. I felt efficient. Angry, yes. Sad, yes. But underneath it all ran something cleaner. Decision. Around 9, I walked out onto the porch while Daniel secured another load in the truck. Across the street, Mr. Henderson was watering his roses like he did every summer evening, shoulders rounded, hose in one hand, radio faintly playing somewhere behind him. He waved. "Moving already," he called. I smiled the polite neighborhood smile people use when the truth would require too much backstory. Just heading out for a while. He nodded. Newlyweds. Good time to start fresh. If only he knew. Daniel joined me on the porch after dropping the final box into the truck bed. He locked the front door, then placed the house keys in my hand. They were warm from his palm. I stared at them for a second. House key, back door key, mailbox key, 10 years on a little metal ring. Then I opened the mailbox, dropped them inside, and heard them land with one small hard sound. "Jason will find them," Daniel said. "Good," I answered. We climbed into the truck just after 9:30. The cab smelled like cardboard, motor oil, and the last of the peonies from my bouquet, which had shed petals all over the passenger seat. I looked once at the house. Dark windows, empty rooms, white siding, the porch where I used to sit after shifts with iced tea and swollen ankles. The only home I had ever fully paid for with my own exhaustion. "You okay?" Daniel asked. I looked ahead at the road instead. "I think so." He started the truck. "Good. Because tomorrow morning is going to be very educational for your family." I should have felt guilt then. Old me would have. Old me would have spent the entire drive explaining to myself why this was too much, too harsh, too humiliating, too mean. But old me had spent 38 years subsidizing other people's comfort with my silence. New me was tired. And as we drove south out of Columbus under a darkening sky, with the last of the wedding ribbons still tied to the truck antenna fluttering like a joke the universe had decided to keep telling, I realized something with a calm that scared me a little. I was not running. I was leaving them with exactly what they had asked for. The house. Or at least the version of it they thought they had won. And by sunrise, when my father opened that front door and Jason walked inside, expecting ownership and easy victory, the letter I left on the kitchen counter would finally teach them the difference between getting what you demand and understanding what it costs. At 7 the next morning, my parents pulled into the driveway like people arriving early for a blessing they believed was rightfully theirs. I can picture it perfectly even though I wasn't there, because Jason told me later, and because some scenes are so predictable once you know the people in them that you don't need a security camera to reconstruct the choreography. My father drove, of course, because he always preferred to be the one holding the illusion of control, even when the road ahead was built entirely out of his own bad decisions. My mother sat in the passenger's seat with a handbag on her lap, and that false calm she wears when she thinks the situation can still be managed by using softer vowels. Jason followed in his truck, too excited to even pretend dignity. In his mind, this was move-in day. New business, fresh start, free house, a little reward from the family system that had always bent in his direction. He stepped out first, rubbing his hands together like winter had come with profit. "Well," he said, looking up at the porch, "let's see my new place." That phrase alone tells you everything about Jason. Not Emily's old house. Not the place. My new place. Entitlement has a way of arriving before keys do. My father climbed the steps, reached for the doorknob, and found it locked. Not surprising. Even I wouldn't leave a property transfer open overnight for the raccoons and the relatives. My mother, apparently still committed to the idea that this was a civilized family handoff and not an emotional burglary, said, "Emily must have left the keys somewhere." Jason checked the porch first, then under the flower pot by the door, because apparently he believed I was starring in a children's cartoon about conflict resolution. Nothing. Then he opened the mailbox, and there they were. The keys, all three on the ring. Front door, back door, mailbox. Exactly where I wanted them. Easy to find. Impossible to misread. He held them up with a grin. "See," he said, "I told you she'd come through." That's the thing about people who've been overindulged for decades. They always interpret your restraint as loyalty to them, never as the quiet stage setting for their lesson. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, none of them understood what they were seeing. The human brain likes continuity. It expects a house to behave like a house. It expects a couch in the living room, curtains at the windows, a refrigerator humming somewhere in the back, traces of a person's life still clinging to the corners. Instead, they stepped into emptiness. Not staged emptiness, real emptiness. Every sound bounced. Their footsteps hit the hardwood and came back at them with that bare room echo you only ever hear during move-in day or after something has gone deeply wrong. No sofa, no TV, no dining set, no area rug, no framed family photos, no fake little ceramic bowl by the door for keys. Nothing, just beige walls, pale squares where frames had once hung, and the kind of silence that makes people instantly lower their voices without knowing why. Jason took 3 steps in and stopped hard. "What the hell?" he said. Not angrily at first. Confused. Offended by reality for not cooperating. My father looked past him into the living room, then toward the hall, then into the kitchen, and I know exactly when the first crack of panic hit him because he always goes pale around the mouth before the rest of him catches up. My mother walked into the kitchen, and the sound she made then, Jason said, was not a scream. It was smaller, worse. The noise a person makes when they are still trying to convince themselves there must be an explanation that doesn't implicate them. The refrigerator was gone. The stove was gone. The kitchen table was gone. Even the cheap dish towel ring by the sink had been unscrewed and removed. Nothing but clean counters, dust outlines, and one envelope sitting right in the center like a headstone. "Frank," my mother whispered. I can hear her saying it, too. Not because I miss her, because fear gives everyone the same accent eventually. Jason picked up the envelope first. White. Plain. His name on the front. Not mom and dad. Not the family. Jason. Because if you're going to cut a lie open, it's only polite to address the person who benefited most from it. He turned it over once, like maybe the back would say surprise, then ripped it open. My father snapped, "Well, read it." So Jason did. He unfolded the paper and read the first line out loud. "Dear Jason, about the house." He stopped there, looked up, looked around the kitchen again, then back down like the next sentence might restore the appliances. It didn't. "Before you start repainting the place," he read, "there are a few things you should know." My mother sank into the one folding chair we had deliberately left in the kitchen, which was petty of me, and I stand by it. My father held out his hand. "Give me that." But Jason kept reading, maybe because some tiny animal part of him already knew the letter was about him in a way no one could protect him from. "The contract you brought me transferred my ownership interest in the property. That part is true." Jason frowned. My father said, "Of course it's true, but quieter now, because confident men only get loud when they believe reality is on their payroll." "What you may not have realized," Jason continued, "is that I only owned half the house. That was the sentence that blew the room open. Not literally, but in terms of certainty, yes. Jason looked up first, then at my father, then back at the page. "What?" he said. My father stepped forward so fast the chair legs scraped behind him. "Keep reading." Jason swallowed. The other half of the house was legally owned by Daniel through the refinancing agreement we signed last year. There are pauses, and then there are family pauses. The ones where everyone silently recalculates the last decade. My father actually blinked twice before speaking, which was rare for him because he usually preferred his emotions pre-pressed and hidden in the back closet. "That's not possible," he muttered. But of course it was possible. It had been signed, notarized, recorded, boringly legal and utterly real. Daniel and I refinanced the year before to secure better terms and put his name on half. We did it for marriage, for fairness, for practical life. We did not know at the time it would later serve as the world's most elegant booby trap. Jason kept reading because by then what else could he do? Yesterday afternoon, Daniel finalized the sale of his half of the property. My mother grabbed the edge of the counter. "Sold it to who?" she asked, but not in the tone of a woman seeking information. In the tone of a woman trying to bargain with the sentence before it became law. Jason's voice had gone thin by then. To a property investment company based in Cincinnati. My father snatched the paper from him. "Let me see that." He read the next paragraph himself, lips moving once before sound came out. "The company now has full rights as co-owner to request a buyout or force a petition sale under Ohio law." He looked up then, and this part won love, not because he was in pain, but because for once the pain had no one weaker to go looking for. Jason stared at him. "What does that mean?" My father's jaw worked once, twice. "It means," he said through clenched teeth, "you don't own the house." Jason laughed, but it came out brittle and high. The laugh of a man still trying to insist the magic trick will reverse if he calls it stupid enough times. "Sure I do." Emily signed it over. "Half," my father barked. She signed over half. It is amazing how rarely the favorite child ever notices details. That's because details are for people who've had to survive consequences. Jason had spent his whole life surfing assumptions that other people financed. He never needed to read the fine print because my parents always stood nearby ready to make the fine print someone else's burden. Until that morning, my mother said the one thing women like her always say at the edge of reality. But why would she do this? And I wish I could have stood there just to answer. But I didn't need to. The letter did it for me. My father kept reading. "By the time you receive this, Daniel and I will be on the road starting our new life somewhere else." He slammed the paper down onto the empty counter, so hard it made a hollow smack against the laminate. That ungrateful girl. Ungrateful. God. I love when people use that word after you stop subsidizing their comfort. It tells on them instantly. Not wrong. Not unfair. Ungrateful. Meaning, how dare you stop being useful in the exact shape we preferred? Jason had moved from confusion into active panic by then. He started pacing the living room, his boots hitting barewood in frantic bursts. "So what now?" he asked. "We just call them and tell them to undo it." My father didn't answer right away, which was how Jason knew this had entered adult territory. "That's not how contracts work," he said finally. My mother whispered, "There must be some family exception." That line nearly took me out when Jason repeated it later. A family exception. As if county records pause politely when mothers cry in kitchens. As if Ohio property law bends because Diane Carter says this all feels very hurtful. Jason's phone rang then. Unknown number. He answered on speaker because panic loves company. The woman on the other end sounded cheerful, organized, and deeply uninvested in anyone's personal mythology. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. This is Melissa Grant from Hamilton Property Investments. I'm calling about the property at 118 Oak Ridge Lane." Jason looked at my father, suddenly 12 years old again. Yeah. Wonderful, she said. As co-owners, we'd like to discuss the next steps. You have two options. First, you can purchase our half of the property. Current valuation places that at approximately $160,000. $160,000. Jason actually sat down on the floor. How much, he said, like volume might lower it. Alternatively, she continued, if a buyout is not possible, we can initiate a petition sale. The property would then be listed on the open market and sold, with proceeds divided according to ownership share. My father took the phone. This is Frank Carter, Jason's father. Hello, Mr. Carter. There's been some misunderstanding. No, sir, she said pleasantly. There hasn't. I admire women like that. Women who can dismantle a family delusion using customer service syntax. We just need time, my father said. How much time, she asked. He hesitated, and that was all she needed. We typically allow 30 days for buyout negotiations, she said. After that, the company proceeds with petition action. The call ended. No drama, no threats, no music swelling in the background. Just procedure, which is so much crueler to entitled people than yelling ever could be. Jason stared around the empty room. She planned this, he said. And finally, after 38 years of expecting me to be the strong one, the responsible one, the one who bent, they had to stand inside something I had planned without them. That was the lesson. Not revenge. Structure. Because by the time they opened that front door, I was already 3 hours south beside a husband who understood contracts, peace, and timing. And what my parents still did not know, not yet, was that the house was only the first thing they were about to lose. By the time my parents were standing in that empty kitchen in Columbus learning what a petition sale was, Daniel and I were already somewhere south of Cincinnati with the windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of warm asphalt, cut fields, and early summer heat rolling off the highway. I remember the sound of the truck more than anything. That low, steady engine noise under us, the occasional rattle from one of the boxes in the back, the little flap of wedding ribbon still tied to the antenna because neither of us had bothered to cut it off yet. There was something almost funny about that. We were driving away from the biggest family betrayal of my life in a pickup truck decorated like newlyweds in a town parade. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting loose near the gear shift, and every now and then he'd glance at me, not because he thought I might fall apart, but because he knew sometimes people go too quiet when they are trying to hold all their pieces still at once. I said eventually, eyes on the long strip of highway ahead. I don't feel guilty. He gave the smallest nod. That's because you finally stopped volunteering for a punishment you didn't earn. That line sat in the truck for a minute like something too true to move around casually. The old version of me would have argued. She would have said things like, but they're still my parents, and Jason's always been like this, and I don't want to be cruel. The old version of me had spent years translating abuse into context because context felt safer than anger. But that day, with my house already gone from underneath them and my future packed in boxes behind us, I didn't argue. I just leaned my head against the seat and watched the green of southern Ohio blur into Kentucky. There is a point on long drives where the body starts to believe what the mind is still catching up to. Somewhere past the state line, I felt it. Not joy, not yet, but relief beginning to unclench. We stopped once just outside Lexington for gas and coffee. It was one of those service stations with a little convenience store attached, fluorescent lights, rotating hot dogs that looked like they had given up on themselves, and a cashier who had clearly seen enough road-weary couples to know better than to ask where we were headed unless we volunteered it first. Daniel pumped gas while I went inside and stared at the coffee station longer than necessary, because the simple act of choosing between hazelnut and burnt dark roast felt absurdly gentle after the morning my family had just had. When I came back out, he was leaning against the truck looking at his phone. Anything? I asked. He held up the screen. 3 missed calls from my father, 2 from my mother, 1 voicemail from Jason. "You want me to listen?" he asked. I shook my head. Not yet. That's another thing I learned too late in life. You do not owe immediate access to people who only discovered your value once you stop cooperating. Silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes it's the only room where your self-respect can get dressed in private. So we kept driving. We crossed into Tennessee the next morning, just after sunrise. The hills softened. The roads curled more than they stretched. Fields gave way to tree lines and church signs and little gas stations with hand-painted boards advertising biscuits before 10 a.m. The air changed too, lighter somehow, damp with creek water and cut hay, and that faint wood smoke smell that lingers in small towns, even when no one nearby is actively burning anything. Daniel rolled the window down farther and smiled in a way I had not seen in weeks. "That," he said, breathing in, "smells like growing up." Daniel's hometown is called Franklin Hollow. Not big enough to impress anyone, big enough to matter. 40 minutes outside Nashville if you catch the lights right. 1 grocery store, 1 diner, 1 church big enough to host every major family argument within a 15-mile radius, a clinic, a hardware store, and the kind of people who still wave when they pass you because they assume roads are shared and so is trouble. His older sister lives there with her husband and 2 teenage sons who eat like they're trying to prove something to the agricultural economy. She had been trying to lure him back for years. "You work too hard in Columbus," she used to say. "Come home where people know your name and your truck." I think Daniel always loved hearing that. But until my family forced the issue, we hadn't really let ourselves imagine leaving. We pulled into town around breakfast, and he took me straight to the diner on Main Street, because apparently in his family, you do not relocate without first being fed by somebody who has known you since the Clinton administration. The sign outside blinked open in red neon that had seen better decades. Inside smelled like bacon, coffee, syrup, and old boots polished by generations of denim. The woman behind the counter looked up, squinted once, and then slapped the counter with 1 palm. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. Daniel Harper actually came back. That was Linda. Late 60s, sturdy, practical haircut, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the kind of woman who can refill coffee and assess your character in the same arm movement. She came around the counter and hugged him hard, then turned to me with those quick, bright eyes older Southern women use when deciding whether they approve of your bones. "And this must be the wife," she said. "You poor thing. Sit down, honey." He always looked like trouble with good posture. It was the first time anyone had made me laugh without accidentally touching my grief in 2 days. We slid into a booth by the window. Linda poured coffee, called me sweetheart without making it sound like ownership, and brought us plates big enough to qualify as emotional intervention. Eggs, biscuits, sausage, hash browns, all of it. "Your sister already told half the county you might be coming back," she said to Daniel. I told her not to get dramatic until she had confirmation. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing at that. Dramatic, apparently, means something very different when said by people who still have a sense of humor. It felt strange at first, sitting there in my wedding band shine, road-tired and emotionally bruised, listening to people talk to Daniel like he was not an insufficient mechanic, but a person whose return mattered. That was the thing my parents never understood about him. Daniel doesn't collect attention. He earns trust, and in places like Franklin Hollow, trust is more expensive than polished opinions. After breakfast, we drove out to see the cottage his sister had lined up for us to rent. It sat just beyond town on 2 quiet acres with a white fence leaning in one place like it had decided perfection was for richer properties. 2 bedrooms, wide porch, old wood floors, a creek running behind the yard under a stand of trees that looked like they had outlived several family feuds already. Nothing fancy, But the second I stepped inside with the windows open and the curtains moving and all that stillness around the rooms, I felt something that startled me. Safety. Not because the house was grand, because it was unentitled. It wasn't attached to my parents' expectations. It wasn't a reward for being responsible. It wasn't bait. It was just a place. A clean, ordinary place to start breathing in. Daniel set our bags down in the front room and watched me slowly turn in a circle, taking it in. "Well," he asked. "I think," I said, and my voice cracked a little in spite of myself, "this might be the first place I've ever stood in that doesn't feel like someone else can take it from me." He didn't say anything to that. He just came over and pulled me against him and let me cry into his shirt for exactly as long as I needed without narrating my feelings back to me like a therapist who charges by the hour. We spent the afternoon unpacking essentials: towels, coffee pot, 2 pans, toothbrushes, work clothes, the framed photo of me on closing day in front of my old house, which I set face down in the drawer for now because healing has timing, and I wasn't interested in forcing mine into Pinterest quotes yet. Around 4, I called the clinic in town because practical life does not pause just because your family finally detonated the lie you've been living under. They needed a nurse. Of course they did. Small clinics always do. The doctor asked about my hospital experience, about triage, about chronic care, about whether I was comfortable seeing the same faces over and over and having to remember not just symptoms, but grandchildren and grief anniversaries. "That's the part I'm best at," I told him. He paused and then said, "When can you start?" I looked out the kitchen window at the creek moving behind the yard and said, "Next week." When I hung up, Daniel was leaning in the doorway grinning. "Got it." "Yep." "Good," he said. "Because your first day as a Tennessee woman should probably involve a paycheck plan." That evening, my phone finally became impossible to ignore. First my mother, then my father, then Jason, then all 3 again. It was almost funny how timing works when people realize leverage has changed addresses. I let it ring through dinner. We ate takeout barbecue on unpacked boxes in our own kitchen, sauce dripping onto paper plates, and every time the phone buzzed, Daniel would glance at it like it was a mosquito neither of us felt obliged to respect. Finally, just before dark, he asked, "You want to hear any of them?" I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. 12 missed calls, 1 voicemail from my father, 3 texts from my mother, increasingly emotional in punctuation, 2 from Jason, one of which simply said, "This is insane." I put the phone back down. "Not yet," I said. "I want them to sit in it a little longer." Daniel nodded, like a man approving a repair strategy. "Good plan." But the truth is, by then my family's punishment had already begun. Not because of anything I'd said, because for the first time in their lives, they were having to experience the consequences of a decision without my immediate labor cushioning the impact. Jason was about to learn that temporarily doesn't impress investment companies. My father was about to discover that legal paperwork is less flexible than daughters trained to say yes. And my mother, for perhaps the first time in her life, was going to have to sit in a room where emotional softness could not refinance a bad choice. I didn't know every detail yet. I only knew the first round of panic had started. And when I finally did decide to answer Jason 4 days later, standing on the back porch of the clinic with the Tennessee heat pressing soft against the trees and the creek moving behind me like it had all the time in the world, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "Emily," he said, and for the first time in his life, he sounded smaller than me. "You need to fix this." That was the moment I realized the empty house hadn't just scared them. It had exposed them. And once people are exposed, they usually start telling the truth in ugly little pieces. Jason called me 4 days after the investment company mailed the paperwork. And by then, Franklin Hollow had already started doing something my old life rarely allowed. It had given me enough quiet to hear myself think before somebody else's crisis climbed on my shoulders. I was standing on the back porch of the clinic behind a stack of supply boxes, learning where they kept extra blood pressure cuffs and sample inhalers when my phone buzzed in my scrub pocket. Columbus area code. I didn't need the caller ID to know who it was. Some family numbers live in your nervous system like old weather. Daniel was inside the waiting room filling out volunteer forms because he decided if we were going to start over somewhere small, he might as well become useful faster than gossip. He looked up through the glass when he saw my face change and mouthed, "Family?" I nodded once. He didn't tell me not to answer. He didn't do that false protective thing some men do when they think loyalty means making your decisions louder than yours. He just leaned back in the chair and gave me the look that meant the same thing it always did. Whatever you choose it with your whole spine. I stepped out onto the porch, closed the screen door behind me, and answered. "Hello." There was a long pause first. Not because the line was bad, because Jason had never once in his life had to call me from the weaker position, and apparently even his lungs needed a moment to adjust. "Emily," he said finally, and just that one word, my name in his voice, told me more than anything else could have. Gone was the lazy swagger, the frat boy confidence, the casual assumption that if he pushed hard enough someone older and more responsible would eventually solve the practical part. He sounded tired. Thin. Cornered. "Yes," I said. "Where are you?" That was his opening line. Not "how are you?" Not "why did you do this?" Not "congratulations on the wedding I barely acknowledged before trying to seize your house 3 days later." Just "where are you?" As if geography itself might be the solution. I leaned my shoulder against the porch post and looked out at the creek behind the clinic. Water moving brown-green over stones under a stand of trees that looked completely uninterested in Ohio family nonsense. "Why?" I asked. "Because Mom and Dad are freaking out," he snapped, and there was the Jason I knew, peeking through panic. Even terrified, he still led with inconvenience to others instead of introspection. "That sounds stressful," I said. He let out a bitter breath. "This isn't funny. I'm not laughing," which was true mostly. I wasn't laughing. I was listening. And that is what people like Jason almost never expect. They expect argument, defense, a big emotional scene they can step around while still keeping the center. Listening is much worse because it leaves them alone with the logic of what they've done. "You need to fix this," he said. There it was. No apology. No admission. Straight to assignment. Emily the repair department. Emily the adult in the room. Emily the one who absorbs. I could practically hear our entire childhood packed into that sentence. Jason with a suspension. Emily explain it to Dad. Jason short on rent. Emily float him until payday. Jason going through something. Emily understand. Fix what? I asked. He made an incredulous sound, like I was being difficult for sport. The house. The company. All of it. You know what I mean. "No," I said calmly. "I know what happened. I'd like to hear what you think happened." Silence. Wind in the trees. A screen door banging faintly somewhere on the far side of the clinic. Then he said, with all the confidence of a man reciting nonsense he had not personally fact-checked, "You tricked us." I actually smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was so nakedly revealing. "Jason," I said, "I signed the contract you brought me." "Yeah, but you set it up so the house could be sold." "No, I set it up so your understanding of ownership would finally have to meet reality." He blew out a breath. "This is exactly what Dad said you'd do. Make it into some big, dramatic point." There it was. Dad again. My father's voice had always functioned in our family like an aftermarket moral coding. Whatever ugly thing he wanted could be painted practical if he said it slowly enough. "What exactly did Dad say?" I asked. Jason hesitated, which told me the answer mattered. He said you'd either cave completely or try to pull some technical nonsense because you always need to feel smarter than everybody. I let that sit for a second. Funny how threatened people become by a woman who simply reads what's in front of her. Did he also say he was the one who thought the house should stay in the family? Jason said nothing. Jason? Yeah, he muttered. That was his idea. There it was. Not because I was surprised. Because hearing the favored child say it out loud changes the shape of blame. My mother supplied the emotional softener. Always. Jason supplied the appetite. But my father supplied architecture. He was the one who took entitlement, dressed it in practical language, and called it responsible. He said, Jason went on, voice lower now, that once you were married, the house mattered less to you. That you had Daniel now. That it would make sense for the property to help family, which in our household had always translated to transfer resources toward Jason and call it love. I thought about my father sitting at my kitchen table, folding his arms, telling me I owed the family while the man I had just married stood 10 feet away watching my parents try to annex my life before the wedding gifts were fully unpacked. The heat rose up my neck then, slow and clean. Not explosive, just clarifying. And you believed him, I said. I mean, he stumbled. He's dad. Exactly. That landed. I could hear it. Jason had spent his whole life confusing parental authority with moral truth because that confusion always paid him. It is very hard to teach a grown man that his comfort was subsidized by someone else's sacrifice when no one has ever made him do the math. Do you know how many extra shifts I worked to buy that house? I asked. He didn't answer. Do you know how many nights I came home from the hospital too tired to eat standing up? Much less go out or spend money or take trips. Do you know what 10 years of saying no looks like in a person's body? That's not fair, he muttered. No, I said. The fair part would have been Mom and Dad helping both of us when we were young, instead of treating you like a project and me like a utility. That quieted him in a way nothing else had yet. Then he did something I did not expect. He stopped arguing and started sounding honest. I thought, he said, then quit. Thought what? I thought you'd complain. Maybe cry. But I thought you'd sign because you always do the right thing. There it was. The family legend of me. Not that I had needs. Not that I had limits. Not that I had earned the right to protect what was mine. Just that I would do the right thing. Which in their language meant the convenient thing for them. I did do the right thing, I said. Just not for you. He was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. Then he said, softer, Mom's been crying. And I wish I could tell you that line bounced right off me because I was finally free and healed and emotionally bulletproof. It didn't. My mother's sadness still found me because daughters like me are built that way. We can know exactly who someone is and still flinch when they sound hurt. But pain is not innocence. Tears do not reverse contracts. I never wanted to hurt her, I said. Then why leave, he asked. Not why protect the house. Why leave? That question mattered because it meant somewhere under all the panic and entitlement, he had started to understand that this wasn't about real estate anymore. Because I needed a life that wasn't built on giving things away every time someone in this family called it love. He breathed in slowly. You happy there? I looked past the clinic, over the grass and trees, and the small white fence near the road, and for the first time in a very long time the answer came without negotiation. Yes, I said. I am. Another pause. Then, almost to himself, huh? That single syllable carried more learning than anything else he'd said all call. Because I think in that moment Jason realized something my family had never once seriously considered. My life could be full without their approval. Their power had always relied on the assumption that I needed them enough to keep paying for access. Now, suddenly I didn't. He tried one last time. The company says we've got 20 days before they force a sale. That sounds right. We can't afford to buy them out. I know. Dad talked to a lawyer. I assumed he would. The lawyer said the contract is solid. I almost laughed at the wounded disbelief in his tone, as if it were personally offensive that boring legal documents had chosen consistency over family mythology. Jason, I said, and my voice softened because cruelty wasn't what I wanted from this call. Clarity was, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm just done rescuing everyone at the cost of myself. He didn't answer for a while. Then, I guess I never thought about what it cost you. That sentence, not an apology, not enough, but true, and truth, even late and badly dressed, matters. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in years, I told him. He made a short sound that might have been shame or might have been relief. Probably both. Before he hung up, he said one more thing. Dad's never going to admit he was wrong. I looked out at the Tennessee sky and said he might not have to say it out loud. Consequences are pretty fluid. Then I ended the call. When I went back inside, Daniel looked up from the paperwork stack and asked, "Well?" I sat in the chair across from him and let the moment settle. Jason finally sounded his age, I said. That good? That scared? Daniel nodded once, like a mechanic listening to an engine and recognizing the moment a hidden issue finally becomes audible. Good, he said. Sometimes that's the first step. Maybe it was, maybe not. But what I knew for certain was this. The sale sign had not even gone up yet. My father was already calling lawyers. My mother was crying in kitchens. Jason was finally learning the price of assuming I would always catch him. And the strangest part of all was that the farther south I got from Columbus, the less any of it felt like revenge. It felt like oxygen, which meant the next move mattered. Because once people stop seeing you as a permanent resource, they begin rewriting history at speed. And if my parents were going to try to turn this into some tragic misunderstanding where poor Emily just overreacted, I needed to decide whether I would let silence keep teaching them, or if it was finally time to make them sit down in a room and say the truth with all the furniture still upright. 3 months after the house sold, my mother's letter arrived in the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon when the Tennessee heat had turned the gravel driveway white and bright, and the cicadas were making that electric summer noise that sounds like the whole tree line is under tension. I had just come home from the clinic with a faint headache from 2 blood pressure follow-ups, 1 diabetic foot check, and a widow named Mrs. Talbot who insisted on telling me every detail of her nephew's 3rd divorce before allowing me to listen to her lungs. Daniel was under the hood of a Chevy pickup behind the garage, radio playing low, 1 boot braced against the bumper, and the smell of motor oil and hot metal drifted across the yard in a way I had come to love, because it meant life was happening honestly nearby. I almost missed the envelope because it was tucked under a feed store circular and a church bulletin someone always slid into every box on our road, whether they knew your denomination or not. Columbus return address. My mother's handwriting. Still the same narrow, neat loops she used when labeling Christmas gifts and signing school absence notes, and apparently now writing letters to daughters she had nearly trained herself out of having. I stood there at the mailbox longer than was reasonable, turning it over in my hand like the weight might tell me whether it held guilt, manipulation, or the kind of apology women like my mother only reach for once all the softer forms of control have failed. Daniel looked up from the truck, saw the envelope, and didn't call out. He just wiped his hands on a rag and waited. That's how he is. He never hurries me into emotional weather. I opened it on the porch. 1 page. No perfume. No passive-aggressive family newsletter folded inside. Just 1 sheet of lined paper. Emily, it began, which already told me she wasn't coming in through sentiment because my mother only used sweetheart when she wanted leverage. She wrote that she and my father had spent the last few months thinking about everything that had happened. She wrote that she wasn't going to pretend she fully understood all of it, which was the most honest thing she had put on paper in years, because my mother has always preferred understanding herself as kind to understanding herself as wrong. Then came the line that made me sit down hard in the porch chair. When the house sold, it felt like we lost more than property. It felt like we lost our daughter. I read that part 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did, perfectly, and because I wanted to see whether the words shifted shape if I looked long enough. They didn't. She wrote that my father hadn't said much, but she could see it sitting on him. She wrote that Jason had started working full-time at the hardware store and that maybe, just maybe, having to stand on his own feet for once was doing him more good than all the family rescuing had ever done. Then she asked if I would come visit. No contracts, no expectations, just a visit. Love, Mom. Not the biggest apology in the world, not a dramatic confession, but real enough to disturb the peace I had built. Daniel came up the porch steps then and held out his hand without asking. So I gave him the letter and watched him read it with the same calm concentration he gives to service manuals and invoices. When he finished, he looked out across the yard at the fence line before saying, "That's closer to accountability than she's ever gotten, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yeah." "And your father?" Still hiding behind furniture, apparently. That got a smile out of him. That tracks. We sat there a while with the evening settling in around us, the light going slower and softer over the trees, and he asked the question nobody in my family had ever asked me cleanly. "What do you want?" Not what should I do? Not what would look good. Not what would keep the peace. What do I want? It took me a while to answer because women raised in houses like mine are often taught to confuse desire with selfishness. So early they need silence to remember the difference. Finally, I said, "I think I want to see if they can tell the truth in person." Daniel nodded once. "Then we go. And if they can't, we leave." That was the plan. No heroic reconciliation fantasy. No pressure. Just a door open once on my terms. 2 weeks later, we drove back to Ohio. And I can't explain to you how different that trip felt from the one where we left. The first time, every mile south had felt like escape. This time it felt like return without surrender, which is a very different thing. We pulled into my parents' driveway just after lunch on a cloudy Sunday, and the house looked almost offensively unchanged. Same white siding, same hydrangeas, same maple tree in the front yard. The house had not suffered visibly for what had happened inside it. Houses are rude that way. They keep standing while families edit the wreckage around them. My mother opened the door before we even knocked twice. For 1 second, she just stared at me, and I saw it there, the cost of the months between us. Not cinematic suffering. Realer than that. Less polished. Then she hugged me hard enough to wrinkle my blouse and whispered, "I missed you," into my shoulder like the words had been waiting behind her teeth for a while and weren't built for public release. I hugged her back because, contrary to popular storytelling, boundaries do not erase longing. My father was at the kitchen table when we stepped inside. He looked older, but not in the dramatic silver-haired movie way. Older in the eyes, in the posture, like consequence had finally found a place to sit on him and had no plans to leave. Jason was there too, standing awkwardly by the fridge like somebody who had been told to keep his hands visible and his personality under control. Daniel shook my father's hand. My father nodded at him with more respect than I'd ever seen directed his way, and that alone told me some things had already shifted. We sat. My mother made coffee because women like her would rather boil alive than have a hard family conversation without offering baked goods or caffeine first. Nobody knew how to start. The room had that careful quality people have when they know the old script won't work anymore, but haven't memorized the new one yet. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "I suppose you know why we asked you here." "I have an idea," I said. He rubbed his palms together once, looked down, then up again. "For years," he said, "your mother and I told ourselves we were helping Jason." He stopped there, swallowed, And I swear the whole room leaned toward him because my father was not a man who normally touched his own failures with bare hands. But we weren't helping him, he went on. We were protecting him. And we were doing it with your life. There it was. Not poetic, not grand, but true. My mother looked down into her coffee. Jason didn't move. I didn't speak either because some truths deserve enough air to stand up fully before anyone starts decorating them with forgiveness. My father let out a breath and said, "We expected you to carry what he dropped. We called it strength because that sounded better than what it was." That line nearly got me. Because yes, exactly, that had always been the trick. I wasn't the strong one. I was the absorbent one. The one designated to lose quietly so everyone else could remain comfortable in their own reflected innocence. Jason finally spoke then, and his voice had none of its old swagger left in it. "I should have said no," he said, staring at the table. "The day with the contract. I knew it was wrong. I thought because it was you, it would somehow be fine." He gave one miserable little laugh that had no humor in it at all. "That sounds terrible out loud." "It is terrible out loud," I said. "That's what truth sounds like the first time." He nodded, because there was nothing else for him to do with that. My mother started crying then, quietly, not theatrically, and for once I didn't rush to make that easier for her. That was the biggest difference between the old Emily and the woman sitting there in that kitchen now. I did not scramble to suit the people who had made me bleed. I let them feel what they had done. My mother finally looked up and said, "I kept telling myself we were just trying to keep the family together." "No," I said, and my own voice surprised me with how calm it was. "You were trying to keep the arrangement together. There's a difference." Even my father nodded at that. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not perfectly, not cleanly. There were silences, some defensiveness. My mother trying twice to use the phrase, "You know how families get," and me shutting that down because no, families do not get anything by accident when one child is always being handed the bill. My father admitted he had been the one to push the house idea because he genuinely believed that once I was married, I had more than enough. That phrase sat in the room like spoiled food. More than enough. As if a husband turned my home into surplus. As if my life became communal property the moment there was a ring on my finger. Jason admitted the hardware store had been the first job where he'd had to show up whether he felt like it or not. And that strange, humiliatingly basic lesson had taught him more about adulthood than any family rescue ever did. And then my father said something I did not expect to hear in my lifetime. I was wrong. Just that. No backstory. No cushion. No, but my father, the man who could turn even weather into a lecture, finally laid down one clean sentence without trying to negotiate its edges. I looked at him and realized something then. Repair is not the same as reset. We were not going back. There was no old version of us waiting under a blanket somewhere. But maybe there was a new one possible, if everyone in the room could stand the ugliness of truth long enough to stop performing. When we left that evening, my mother hugged me again. Jason hugged Daniel awkwardly and thanked him for not, and I quote, beating my ass that day in the kitchen, which Daniel found so funny he laughed all the way to the driveway. My father walked me to the truck and stood there with both hands in his pockets, looking at the gravel instead of at me. "You handled it better than I deserved," he said. "No," I answered. "I handled it honestly." He nodded once. That too. A year has passed since then. Life in Franklin Hollow settled into something I no longer confuse with boring just because it is peaceful. I work at the clinic. Daniel's shop is steady. We bought a small place with a porch and a creek and enough room for tomatoes and quiet. My parents visit every couple of months. My mother brings pies. My father sits longer than he talks, which for him is practically a spiritual conversion. Jason still works at the hardware store. He says, "I'll figure it out less," and "I already handled it more." which is maybe the first real sign of progress. Do I trust them completely? No, that would be childish. But trust isn't a light switch. It's a bridge rebuilt one board at a time, and this time I'm the one deciding where it leads. People ask me sometimes, usually older women at the clinic who recognize the shape of the story before I finish telling it, whether I regret signing the contract. And every time I give them the same answer, no, because for the first time in my life, I stopped protecting a family pattern just because I had been assigned the role of strength inside it. And once you stop doing that, you learn something nobody who benefits from your sacrifice wants you to know. Love should never feel like losing your house piece by piece while people call it generosity. Real love has weight, yes. Responsibility, yes. But it does not arrive with prongs in a folder and ask for your future in exchange for belonging. So let me ask you this. If your own family had spent years teaching you that being the strong one really meant being the one who gives things up first, would you have signed the paper too? And if you had, would you have left them an empty house? Or would you have stayed long enough to hear them explain why they thought they were entitled to the furniture too?